Good morning, dear students. Today we are going to continue Mother's Day, and we are going to wind it up today itself. So, hopefully, I am audible loud and clear to you, dear students. Please confirm me once with the text so that I can begin my lesson. Please confirm me with the text whether I am audible loud and clear to you. All of you, good morning. Good morning. Can you please confirm me with the text if I am audible loud and clear so that I can start my lesson? Pravash, let me first finish my lesson, and then if there is time left, I will certainly let you know your marks. Okay. So let me begin first. Thank you, Pravash, for your confirmation. Okay. So let me finish the lesson first, and then I shall discuss the marks with you. Okay. Okay. So here you can see Mrs. Pearson, in the personality of Mrs. Fizzerel, has become so bold in her family that she has taken everyone by surprise. Her family members are not in a position to understand what has happened with her. Okay. So Mrs. Pearson has become very much logical and argumentative with the rest of the members of her family, and now she has also taken on her husband, that is George, and she has told him not to go to the club frequently, because in the club he is ridiculed by other members of the club. Therefore, everyone has come to their senses, and let's see what happens now. So Mrs. Pearsons' response to Cyril's statement we are going to start with today. Okay, so for that we've got to read from Mrs. Pearsons' dialogue. She says, sometimes it does people good to have their feelings hurt. Okay, that's very interesting. That's really very interesting. Okay, here she said is sometimes it does people good to have their feelings hurt. Mrs. Pearson says to her son, the truth ought not to hurt anybody for long. If your father did not go to the club so often, perhaps they would stop laughing at him. Okay, it means that first Mrs. Pearson tells her son, it is sometimes good to hurt people's feelings. Why? Because they learn a lesson, and this is how they change themselves. Okay, so therefore Mrs. Pearson means to say that sometimes it's good that we hurt someone for their betterment. Okay, and then she goes on to say to her son that if his father, that is Mr. George, could not visit the club frequently, then people perhaps would not laugh at him so much. Okay, now Cyril says, I doubt it. Okay, Cyril does not agree to his mom's statement. He says, I doubt it. Even if he went not very frequently, according to Cyril, they would have laughed at him. Let's see. Mrs. Pearson severely, possibly you do, but what I doubt is whether your opinions is worth having. Okay, possibly it is your opinion, Mrs. Pearson says, but I doubt whether your opinion is worth counting. Your opinion is not counted by me at all at this moment. Okay, so this is how she has also hurt the feeling of her son. What do you know? Nothing. She has become angry with her son instead. Okay, she asked, what do you know? Nothing. You spend too much time and good money at greyhound races and dart tracks and ice shows. Okay, so Mrs. Pearson is also not very much happy with her son, because he also spends most part of his day outside. Okay, outside, like she has mentioned here, in greyhound races, dart tracks, ice shows, he's busy involved with most part of the day. Then Cyril sulkily he became angry and says, well, what if I do? What will happen if I go there? I've got to enjoy myself somehow, haven't I? Then Mrs. Pearson says, I wouldn't mind so much if you were really enjoying yourself, but are you? And where is it getting you? There is a sharp, hurried knocking hard of. Okay, so here, dear students, you see Mrs. Pearson differs in her opinion from Cyril. Cyril says that, so what if I go to those places and spend time there? I'm enjoying myself. Then Mrs. Pearson says, I wouldn't mind so much if you really enjoyed yourself. But are you really enjoying? This is what Mrs. Pearson is asking her son Cyril. Are you really enjoying? What are you learning out of this? Where is it getting you? What are you learning out of this? Okay. So what Mrs. Pearson means to say is that that you can spare your time, okay, in some activities, provided these activities become a part of your life and you can follow it on, and it gives you some kind of reward. Okay, it gives you some kind of benefit. We should not get involved in such activities, like for example, for the young generation, video game and all. What kind of benefit? What kind of achievement are you going to get from just being involved in video games, or you can say watching too much movie and all that? These are okay, pastime is okay, weekend activities it's okay, but it should not be a regular activity of your life. Otherwise you shall be simply wasting your time. This is the formative year for all the students, okay? Standard 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. These 4 years are formative years for children. Children should spare their time in some activities which are really constructive and which will give them, or which will benefit them in their studies and in their career. Understood? And when it comes to your hobby or kind of a leisure activity, you can do it on weekends, okay? You can do it on Saturday or you can do it on Sunday. But Monday to Friday, these 5 days, you should be very much focused in your academics so that you don't get distracted. And otherwise what will happen? That will have a tremendous negative impact on your studies as well as your career. Okay, so Mrs. Pearson means to say to her son, what she means to say to her son is that, I don't mind you enjoying, okay, but you should enjoy such activities which is profitable for you, or which are profitable for you, which will certainly take you somewhere in days to come. Okay, but Mrs. Pearson means to say that you are not doing that. Okay, you are just wasting your time. Okay, now there's a sharp hurried knocking heard off left side. Cyril says, might be for me, I will see. Okay, this knocking might be for me. Let me see. Cyril hurries out left. In a moment he re-enters, closing the door behind him. Then Mrs. Pearson says to him, it's that silly old bag from next door, Mrs. Fizzerel. It's that silly old bag from next door, Mrs. Fizzerel. You don't want her here, do you? Mrs. Pearson sharply, certainly I do. I want her to be here. Certainly I want her to be here. Ask her in, and don't call her a silly old bag either. She is a very nice woman with a lot more sense than you will ever have. Okay, so Mrs. Pearson is scolding her son for calling Mrs. Fizzerel, like silly old bag. So the knocking was heard in the door. So this knocking is from Mrs. Fizzerel. Mrs. Fizzerel seems to be coming to Mrs. Pearson's house now, and they will have discussion regarding the progress of Mrs. Pearson for changing her personality and what kind of an impact it has already made to the members of her family. So probably for this reason Mrs. Fizzerel has come to take feedback about the personality exchange. Okay, let's find out. Cyril exits now from the left. Mrs. Pearson finishes her stout, smacking her lips. Cyril re-enters left, ushering in Mrs. Fizzerel, who hesitates in the doorway. Come in, Mrs. Fizzerel. Mrs. Fizzerel, moving to left center anxiously. I just wondered if everything's all right. If everything's all right. Cyril says, no, it isn't. Everything. Cyril has interfered before Mrs. Pearson could reply. He says, no, it isn't. Then Mrs. Pearson sharply says, of course it is. You be quiet. Then Cyril indignantly, means angrily and loudly, he is saying, why should I be quiet? Mrs. Pearson shouting, because I tell you to, you silly spoiled young pican. Okay. This is the spoken word. Pican means full, dull, wheated. Okay. So Mrs. Pearson was shouting at her son Cyril because he was arguing with her mom. Okay. Therefore she became angry and she said, just because I told you to be quiet, you've got to keep quiet, you silly spoiled young pican. Mrs. Fizzerel now responds, protesting nervously, oh no, surely. Mrs. Pearson severely, now Mrs. Fizzerel, just let me manage my family in my own way, please. Okay. See, as I told you, dear students, Mrs. Fizzerel has become Mrs. Pearson now, and Mrs. Pearson has become Mrs. Fizzerel. Okay. Therefore, there is a total contrast in their personality. So, Mrs. Pearson, like Mrs. Pearson in her former personality, cannot even think of being so rude to her son. Understood? Or for that matter, any member of her family. But now that Mrs. Pearson has become of course in the personality of Mrs. Fizzerel has become so rude to her son, therefore Mrs. Fizzerel in the personality of Mrs. Pearson cannot bear this particular sin, cannot tolerate this. Therefore she says, protesting nervously, no, don't be so rude to your son. Oh no, surely. Okay, because Mrs. Fizzerel is there, of course, but in her inside her is the personality of Mrs. Pearson. That is why she protested, saying that, oh no, surely. It means you cannot be so rude to your son or cruel to your son. Then Mrs. Pearson in Mrs. Fizzerel's personality replies, now Mrs. Fizzerel, just let me manage my family in my own way, please. Mrs. Fizzerel, yes, but Cyril. Mrs. Fizzerel here in the personality of Mrs. Pearson, okay, says, yes, but Cyril, but you are scolding Cyril so much. Cyril sulky and glowering. Mr. Cyril Pearson to you, please. Mrs. Fizzerel, Cyril stalks off into the kitchen. Okay. So Cyril just leaves for the kitchen. Okay, and Cyril, he became sulky and he said, Mr. Cyril Pearson to you, please, Mrs. Fizzerel. Okay, Mrs. Fizzerel, you please manage yourself. Okay, manage yourself. And then he left towards the kitchen. Next. Okay, next you see Mrs. Fizzerel moving to the settee, whispering, oh dear, what's happening? Mrs. Pearson calmly, nothing much, just putting them in their places, that's all. Doing what you ought to do have done long since. Doing what you ought to have done long since. Okay, so Mrs. Pearson is saying, I should have done that long before. Okay, long before. What I should have done long before is something that I am doing at the moment. This is what Mrs. Pearson tells to Mrs. Fizzerel. Mrs. Fizzerel is asking now, is George home? She sits beside Mrs. Pearson on the settee. Then Mrs. Pearson says, yes, I have been telling him what they think of him at the club. Mrs. Fizzerel, well, they think a lot of him, don't they? Mrs. Pearson, no, they don't, and now he knows it. Okay, now Mrs. Pearson says, now he knows it. Okay, because I have already told him. Mrs. Fizzerel nervously, oh dear, I wish you hadn't, Mrs. Fizzerel. Okay, you see, dear students, you always keep it in mind, whenever Mrs. Fizzerel is responding now, whenever she responds, she is responding in the personality of Mrs. Pearson. And as Mrs. Pearson is very much timid and very much compliant and very much polite, therefore Mrs. Fizzerel in the personality of Mrs. Pearson is getting very much uneasy and uncomfortable, okay, to think that Mr. Pearson has been reminded of what people think of him, in the cloud. That is why Mrs. Fizzerel is responding in this manner. Oh dear, I wish you hadn't, Mrs. Fizzerel. Okay. So, because like Mrs. Pearson in her former personality can never think of talking to her husband in this manner. Okay, and Mrs. Fizzerel is now in the personality of Mrs. Pearson. Therefore, she is thinking in this manner. How could you do that, Mrs. Fizzerel? Mrs. Fizzerel she has addressed because Mr. Pearson is now Mrs. Fizzerel's personality. That's why. Okay, now Mrs. Pearson, nonsense, doing them all a world of good, and they will be eating out your hand soon. You will see. Okay, Mrs. Pearson says, no, doing them all a world of good. I am doing something good for them, because if they do not transform themselves, if they do not correct themselves, in that case it's a loss for them only. Okay, that is why I am doing something good for them. Mrs. Fizzerel, I don't think I want them eating out of my hand. Okay, Mrs. Fizzerel now says, I don't think I want them eating out of my hand. Of course, means she also, I don't think, she is saying, I don't think I want them eating out of my hand. Means Mrs. Fizzerel in the personality of Mrs. Pearson thinks that yes, I also want them to be independent. Okay, to be not so much dependent on me. But means she in her former personality she could not simply tell them. Okay, therefore she is now regretting. Okay, she is saying, I also did not want them to eat everything out of my hand, means to be dependent on me, but somehow I could not manage to convey the message to them. Mrs. Pearson impatiently, well, whatever you want, they will be doing it. All three of them. Mark my words, Mrs. Pearson. Okay. So Mrs. Pearson became impatient because Mrs. Pearson in the personality of Mrs. Fizzerel cannot be so polite like Mrs. Fizzerel is at the moment. Okay, in her renewed personality, in her new personality. Therefore, Mrs. Pearson became a bit impatient and said, whatever you want, they will be doing it. Okay, they will be doing whatever you want, they will be doing it. All three of them. Mark my words, Mrs. Pearson. Okay, so Mrs. Pearson is addressing Mrs. Pearson. Why? Because Mrs. Pearson indeed is Mrs. Fizzerel and vice versa. Therefore, Mrs. Pearson is addressing Mrs. Fizzerel to be Mrs. Pearson, because Mrs. Fizzerel is in the personality of Mrs. Pearson. That is why Mrs. Pearson is addressing her in this manner. So Mrs. Pearson, that is Mrs. Fizzerel, she is telling Mrs. Mrs. Fizzerel, that is in reality Mrs. Pearson, that you mark my words, whatever I want them, whatever you want, they will be doing now onwards. Okay, they will be doing now onwards, whatever you will be doing now, they will be whatever you want, they will be doing this. Okay, that is my assurance to you. Mark all three of them. Okay, like Cyril, Doris and Mr. George. Okay, George enters left. Now her husband, okay, Mrs. Pearson's husband enters from the left. George enters left. Glumly, he is unpleasantly surprised when he sees the visitor. Who is the visitor? Mrs. Fizzerel. He moves to the armchair left, sits down heavily and glumly lights his pipe. Then he looks from Mrs. Pearson to Mrs. Fizzerel, who is regarding him anxiously. Okay. Now, George just looked in for a minute, I suppose, Mrs. Fizzerel. Mrs. Fizzerel, who does not know what she is saying. Okay. George is trying to draw the attention of Mrs. Fizzerel regarding the changed personality of Mrs. Pearson. Okay. Then Mrs. Fizzerel said, "Who doesn't know what she is saying?" Well, yes, I suppose so, George. Yes, I can understand, George, what she is saying. I can all understand. George became aghast. Aghast means very much disgusted. He said, "George." Then Mrs. about George. Okay. How she's interacting with George, then Mrs. Fizzerel says nervously, "Oh, I am sorry." Okay, "Oh, I am sorry." Why she says, "Oh, I am sorry"? Because who doesn't know what she is saying? Okay, Mrs. Fizzerel initially without understanding what Mr. George wants to say. Okay, she said, who doesn't know what she is saying? Well, yes, I suppose so, George. And about George, also, okay, I did not really know about the fact that how Mrs. Pearson was dealing with George. Okay, that is why she said, "Oh, I am sorry." Mrs. Pearson impatiently, "Now, what does it matter? Your name is George, isn't it? Who do you think you are, Duke of Edinburgh?" Then George angrily, "What's he got to do with it? Just tell me that. And isn't it bad enough without her calling me George? No tea, Pompey Ompy Pearson, and poor Doris has been crying her eyes out upstairs." Yes, crying her eyes out. So George is trying to draw the attention of Mrs. Fizzerel regarding the changed behavior of Mrs. Pearson. Okay, saying that what's he got to do with it? Okay, Duke of Edinburgh is got to do nothing with me, with my personality. Just tell me that. And isn't it bad enough without her calling me George? Okay, it's very much bad. Isn't it bad enough to call me George? No tea, you have not served us tea, you have called me Pompey Ompy Pearson, then you have made poor Doris cry. Okay, so that's all bad. You are not supposed to do all this. Then Mrs. Pearson says, Fizzerel said, waiting, "Oh dear, I ought to have known. Oh dear, I ought to have known." Because Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fizzerel, inside Mrs. Fizzerel is Mrs. Pearson only soft and polite and kind-hearted. Therefore, she has become a bit, hard. Actually, she has become very hard in coming to know about, getting to know about the fact that Mrs. Pearson was so much rude to her husband, her daughter, and so on. Understood? So George, staring at her, annoyed. "You ought to have known. You ought to have known. Why ought you to have known? Nothing to do with you, Mrs. Fizzerel. Look, we are at 6s and 7s here just now, so perhaps you will excuse us." Okay, 6s and 7s means something confused. Okay, we are having a bad patch now, we are having bad time now. We are at 6s and 7 means we are not having the best of times now. Therefore, I hope you excuse us, Mrs. Fizzerel. Okay, we are having difficult time. Then Mrs. Pearson, before Mrs. Fizzerel can reply, he said, "I won't excuse you, George Pearson. Next time a friend and neighbor comes to see me, just say something when you see her, 'Good evening' or 'How do you do' or something, and don't just march in and sit down without a word. It's bad manners." Okay. Now Mrs. Pearson, in the personality, of course, remember, in the personality of Mrs. Fizzerel, has become even more assertive and dominant and strict towards her husband, Mr. George. So what she's saying now, next time any of my neighbor comes to see me, you've got to wish him or her, you've got to say good morning or good evening, or you can say how do you do, okay, or something to strike up a conversation. And otherwise, if you just don't greet or if you don't say anything and just simply sit down, that is bad manner. Okay, so you must learn this. You must learn this etiquette. So this is how she is teaching her husband, that you must have the etiquette enough. If some neighbor from your comes to your house, and you happen to see him or her, you must greet him or her, and then you take your seat. But you have taken your seat without greeting or saying anything, that is bad manners. Okay. Mrs. Fizzerel nervously, "No, it's all right. No, it's all right, because Mrs. Fizzerel is in the personality of Mrs. Pearson, who respects her husband. Therefore, she is saying, no, it's all right. Okay. Mrs. Pearson, no, it's not all right. We'll have some decent manners in this house, or I will know the reason why. Okay. Glaring at George. Well, so Mrs. Pearson says, of course, Mrs. Pearson means here Mrs. Fizzerel. She said, no, it's not all right. We must have some decency, some decent manners in the house. Okay, or otherwise let me know why it's all right. Glaring at George. Well, intimidated. George became intimidated. Intimidated means very much scared or frightened. George says, well, what? Mrs. Pearson taunting him, why don't you get off to your club? Special night tonight, isn't it? They will be waiting for you, wanting to have a good love. Go on then. Don't disappoint them. Don't disappoint the club members. Tonight you are going to have special night. So go there. They will be waiting for you. And they are waiting to laugh at you also, wanting to have a good laugh. Go on then. Don't disappoint them. Okay? Then George bitterly, that's all right. Make me look silly in front of her now. Her means Mrs. Fizzerel. Go on, don't mind me. 6s and 7s means everything is in disorderly state in my house. This is what George is saying. Poor Doris has been crying her eyes out, getting the neighbors in to see the farm, suddenly losing his temper, glaring at Mrs. Pearson and shouting, all right, let her hear it. What's the matter with you? Have you gone barmy or what? Now George, he's even more confused at his wife, saying that, have you gone barmy? Have you taken leave of your senses? Have you gone crazy? What's wrong with you? Mrs. Pearson jumping up savagely, if you shout at me again like that, George Pearson, I will slap your big fat silly face. My goodness. In front of Mrs. Pearson, Mrs. Fizzerel is saying like this. So Mrs. Pearson might have become so very much nervous, okay, so very much uncomfortable. So let's find out. So Mrs. Pearson, in the personality of Mrs. Fizzerel, has become very much angry with George, saying that if you shout at me in this manner, I will not hesitate slapping you on your big fat silly face. Mrs. Fizzerel moaning. Okay, Mrs. Fizzerel, oh no, please, Mrs. Fizzerel. Mrs. Pearson sits, okay, because Mrs. Fizzerel is who is Mrs. Fizzerel here? Pearson. She cannot simply digest the fact that her husband is being insulted in this manner. Therefore, she says, no, please, Mrs. Fizzerel, okay, please control yourself. George staring at her bewildered. Either I am off my chump or you two are. How do you mean? No, please, Mrs. Fizzerel. Look, you are Mrs. Fizzerel. So why are you telling yourself to stop when you are not doing anything? Tell her to stop. Then there would be some sense in it. Staring at Mrs. Pearson, I think you must be tiddly, okay? So here, George, whenever Mrs. Fizzerel, in the personality of Mrs. Pearson, is addressing Mrs. Fizzerel once again, okay, then George has become very much confused. George says, what is going on? Why is Mrs. Fizzerel addressing Mrs. Pearson as Mrs. Fizzerel? I don't understand the reason. What is happening with two of you? Okay, then let's find out. Mrs. Pearson staring up savagely. Say that again, George Pearson. Intimidated, George became very much frightened. All right. Doris enters, left slowly, looking miserable. She is still wearing the wrap. Mrs. Pearson sits on the settee. Mrs. Fizzerel, hello, Doris dear. Doris miserably, hello, Mrs. Fizzerel. Mrs. Fizzerel, I thought you were going out with Charlie Spence tonight. Doris, annoyed, what's that to do with you? Okay, she became irritated. Mrs. Pearson sharply, stop that. Mrs. Fizzerel nervously, no, it's all right. Mrs. Pearson severely, isn't all right. I won't have a daughter of mine talking to anybody like that. Now answer Mrs. Fizzerel properly. Doris, or go upstairs again. Doris looks wonderingly at her father. In despair, don't look at me. I gave it up. I just give it up. Okay? George became very much hopeless now. He said, I just became confused about everything that is going around me. I just given up. Mrs. Pearson fiercely, well, answer her. Doris, sulkily, I was going out with Charlie Spence tonight, but now I have called it off. Means I have postponed it. Mrs. Fizzerel, oh, what a pity, dear. Why have you? Doris, with a flash of temper, because if you must know, my mother's been going on at making me feel miserable and saying he's got buck teeth and he's half-witted. Just because my mom has made fun of, Charlie Spence. She's saying he is. My mom has been mimicking me, making fun of me, mimicking me, and it makes me feel miserable that Charlie Spence is buck teeth means very much foolish, silly, and half-witted, as my mom tells. So therefore, I have decided to postpone my meeting with Charlie Spence tonight or today. Mrs. Fizzerel rather bolder to Mrs. Pearson. Oh, you shouldn't have said that. Okay, Mrs. Fizzerel, in the personality of Mrs. Pearson, is getting uncomfortable, feeling uncomfortable just because Mrs. Fizzerel has already insulted Doris regarding Charlie Spence. That is why she is again drawing the attention of Mrs. Pearson, saying you should not have said that. That is drawing the attention of Mrs. Fizzerel, okay, saying that you should not have said that. Mrs. Pearson, in the personality of Mrs. Fizzerel, sharply, Mrs. Fizzerel, I will manage my family, you manage yours. George, grimly, ticking her off now, are you? Annie is the nickname of Mrs. Pearson. Ticking her off now, you are scolding her, are you? Mrs. Pearson, even more grimly, they are waiting for you at the club, George, don't forget, and don't you start crying again, Doris, okay? Now Mrs. Pearson, in the personality of Mrs. Fizzerel, is saying you go to club, George, they are waiting for you, and Doris, you don't cry in this manner again. Mrs. Fizzerel getting up with sudden decision, that's enough, quite enough. Then George and Doris stare at her bewildered, okay, to Mrs. Fizzerel. To George and Doris, now listen, okay, who is saying now? Mrs. Fizzerel is saying now, okay, Mrs. Fizzerel saying, now listen you two, I want to have a private little talk with Mrs. Fizz. She corrects herself hastily with Mrs. Pearson, so I will be obliged if you will leave us alone for a few minutes. I will let you know when we have finished. Go on please, I promise you that you won't regret it. There is something here that only I can deal with. Okay, so here she's saying Mrs. Fizzerel, that is Mrs. Pearson, in reality, in personality, is saying now you please both of you leave for some time, okay, and she's giving some indirect hint which of course they will not understand. I am doing it for a purpose. I will let you know after we have finished and all that. Okay, means after we have finished changing our personality. Okay. Go on please, I promise you that you won't regret it. There's something here that only I can deal with, okay. I cannot tell you, but I can deal with. Then George rising, I am glad somebody can, because I can't. Come on Doris, okay. So George says mockingly to his wife, at least someone can change you. That's very nice. At least I cannot change you. Come on Doris. George and Doris exit left. As they go, Mrs. Fizzerel moves to left of the small table and sits. She eagerly beckons Mrs. Pearson to do the same thing. Mrs. Fizzerel, we must change back now. We really must. Mrs. Pearson rising. Why? Why should we change back now? Mrs. Fizzerel, because this has gone far enough. I can see they are all miserable and I can't bear it. Okay, because behind Mrs. Fizzerel is the personality of Mrs. Pearson. Therefore, Mrs. Pearson has become very much soft corner once again, saying that no, we must change back now. I can't see my family members being in such a misery. I can't see them. We must change back now. Then Mrs. Pearson says a bit more of the same would do them good. Little bit more, a little bit more is required, little bit more is required to change them. Okay, so I think we should carry on with our exchange personality for some more time, making a great difference already. Of course, making a great difference already. She moves to the right of the table and says, Mrs. Fizzerel, no, I can't stand any more of it. I really can't. We must change back. Hurry up, please, Mrs. Fizzerel. Okay, we must change back. Hurry up, please, Mrs. Fizzerel. Okay, she said, Mrs. Fizzerel, we must change back. Okay, we must change back. Otherwise, I am not able to bear the suffering of my family members. So dear students, in our this much is left, so I shall finish it in my next class. I shall first finish it off, and then I shall switch over to the next chapter. Okay, so let me finish it off, dear students, today. And before that, I can show you some of like, if you want to see your marks as I promised you. How many of you are still connected? Can you please say, just write yes, so that I understand you are still connected with me. Please write yes, those of you who are still listening to me. Okay, Sadha, Suhani, very good. Tanvi, thank you so much. Arya, Anam, Arya Singh, Riya, Utkarsh, Prakhar, Alma, Sahiba, Sadhika. Okay, thank you so much, dear students. Okay, because it so happens students are become very smart. They just say hello, hi, and then they take a back seat. Okay, so Mayur, thank you so much. So dear students, let me show you here. Okay, so dear students, as you can see here, you see these marks, you see, because these marks, just a minute, you see these marks, dear students, these marks you see, okay, so like Aditi 19, Anam 25, Arya 28, Ashutosh 26, Bhargavati, I don't know, you may not have been present or something, your marks are not visible here. Okay, so next Bhushan 22 and half, Harshvardhan 20, Kailani 27, Kunal 20, Mayur 26, Mahek 27, Nidhi 29, 28.5, Prakhar 29, Prathamesh 23, Preeti 24, Rishuras 26, Riya 24, Sanika 22, Simant 16, Savani 28, then Sneha 22, Tanvi 29, Uday 22, and Vinith 26. Okay, so these are the marks, dear students. Hopefully you were able to see it. So these are the marks. You can see this column, you see this column, number and C column you see. So you can see quickly once again. Okay, now you can see this column you can see. This is commerce. Okay, this one is commerce. See, dear students, Aditya 19.5, Alma 27, Arya Divedi 27, Avesh 23, Vagasri. Acha, Vagasri is here. Acha, she is in commerce. 26, Balchandra 23, Bhunesha 27, Chaitanya 21, Gaurav 27, Gauri 24, Harshit 27, Khushi 27, Mansi 25, Manish 27, Nishant 19.5, that is 20, Prabhas 25, Pratik 27, Sahiba 25, Salender 25, Sejal 19, Sanket did not appear, Sadvika 27. Sadvika, you have written very well, very nice. Then Suhani 26, Uday 16, Utkarsh 20. Okay, so dear students, these are the marks for 11 commerce students. Okay. So have you seen, all of you dear students, your marks you have seen now? You have seen your marks now, those who are present, you might have seen your marks, right? Okay, thank you. Thank you. So now I show you how I checked all this. For example, okay, it's all right. Okay, so let me show you dear students how I checked your papers. Some samples I am showing you. Just for example, Bhagyasri. Okay, so you see Bhagyasri is 25.5, that is 26. See, this is how I have checked, dear students. See, this is how I have checked. Like I show you for example, I can show anyone's like Anam. So you see, she has scored 25 out of 30. So you see, this is her paper. I have seen all these papers. Now this is Proctor's paper. Okay, so dear students, I have shown you the papers. Okay, how I have checked your papers. and later on I shall also send you your respective copies. Okay, I shall send you your respective copies later on. Hopefully I have checked also twice, so I don't think there will be any totaling issue, because totaling I have also counted 2 times, dear students. Okay, so in case there is any totaling issue after I circulate the papers to you, then I shall correct it. Okay, so thank you, dear students. Let me take leave of you today. Bye bye, take care, and please do write your comments on my website through the chat box. If you require any question, answer, anything regarding English code, you please text me via the chat option on my website, and I shall certainly revert back to you. Okay, and I shall, as and when I upload your notes, lesson notes on my website, I shall send you a link. And please keep your notebook updated. Please keep your notebook updated, and after you update your notes, please make a PDF file of it, and then you go to my website, and inside your name folder you please drop it. Okay, so that I understand you are up to date with your notebooks. Thank you so much. Bye bye, take care.